And we will get started. Everyone's seeing my screen, correct? Leading from every level, emotional intelligence. Perfect. So the thing I love about this session is today we're really going to start to see some of these ideas and practices come together that we've already been talking about. We've talked about becoming a person of influence. We've talked about becoming or stepping into authentic leadership. Hopefully all of you have started your owner's manual or your IDP, and all of that's really going to be wrapped into today's session. I received an email from someone yesterday stating that they were excited for this session because this is something they need, and this is something that we all need at all times. Before we get started, I want to thank Kathy for joining us today, my partner in crime. She's going to be helping me let people in. So if you get kicked out and need to come back in, and then helping me moderate the chat. So thank you for that. We also have a team joining us in the chat. You'll see Mary here and her team from Stone Specialists. They do not have audio and camera. So if you could pop some comments in there so that they feel included and as a part of the group, that would be great. I'd also like to thank our virtual platform sponsor, the Ferris Wheel. If my kids weren't home for spring break this week, that's exactly where I'd be. They offer monthly memberships, conference rooms, flexible workspaces. They've got a wellness center and classes. They're located in downtown Flint. So if you're not familiar, check them out. They've also got Foster Coffee in the bottom first floor, and then Flint Prints. So thank you to the Ferris Wheel. All right, so let's go ahead and get right into it. You will see an email that just came through, and I'm going to go ahead and pop that file in the chat here shortly. Don't do anything with it just yet. But as I stated, we're here today to talk about emotional intelligence. And for us as leaders, having emotional intelligence is really, really essential for our success. When you think of the best leaders that you've ever encountered, it's oftentimes that you don't think about the ones who scream at their team, who are very mean, who are very short. You think about the ones who stay calm, cool, and collected, the ones who can come into a situation, use that critical thinking, and really assess what's going on. And those are the things that we're going to be tapping into today. When we think of emotional intelligence, it's really kind of this constant struggle between the head and the heart. And those who are very strong in emotional intelligence are the ones who are able to really blend the two together perfectly. So ultimately, it's the ability to understand the way that people feel and react, and using that ability to make good judgments. So why is this important to you? It's very important to you as an individual, but to your business, it can mean actual dollars. So studies show a strong link between emotional intelligence and the bottom line, and that link comes from the leaders within a company. Emotional intelligence is something that increases individual performance, leadership, and organizational productivity. So when you think of the leaders, all of us within an organization, we really prime the emotional state of that organization. When you see ineffective leaders, how they treat each other, how they treat other people, those types of behaviors and activity trickle down and throughout the entire place like the plague. You've seen it before, I'm sure. On the opposite side of that, the result could be low employee engagement, high turnover, because of these toxic interactions with people. So you can come off of chat, or I'm sorry, come off of mute or type it in the chat. Have any of you ever witnessed a bad reaction to an emotional situation? And you don't have to get into specifics with names or anything like that, but yes or no. And then if you want to explain it a little bit, that'd be great.
So, Brad, I was going to mention that I've seen a lot with supervisors and managers and owners that unfortunately, when they get too dictated by their own personal emotions, they respond to getting rid of the emotion instead of actually solving the problem.
Yeah, that's a good example. Got a couple of comments in the chat. Lots of yeses. We've all been in that situation before. I've been in situations before where I've seen leaders throw a pen, throw a notebook, things that you know are not the right things to do. But like Sean says, people who just get too caught up into their emotions and they aren't able to regulate them in the moment. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later on. The perfect way to assess where you're at, though, is to take an assessment. And we're going to talk a lot about assessments later on, but I have one quick one for you to do. It's only going to take about 5 minutes. And like I said, I have already sent you an email, but I'm also going to send you the file in the chat. So if you saw the email, go ahead and open that up. Let me find it here in my chat. Send you. One second, it's making me save a copy. Now, this assessment is going to be very basic. There are longer assessments that you can find online. Today in the Leadership Toolbox, your suggested reading, the book suggested reading is going to be Emotional Intelligence 2.0. That one also has an assessment that comes along with it. So lots of different assessments out there that you can use. For today's purposes, this assessment is going to be completely guided by the presentation. So you're seeing that now in the chat. You have it in your email. Go ahead and open it up. I sent it as an editable Word document, so you can just use your keyboard to type in your answers. You're going to read each statement, and then across the top, you'll see a ranking of that statement. Whichever matches to you, you're going to go ahead and put an X in that box. Do it all the way down. I'll give you about 5 minutes. And then when you're all set, you can go ahead and send me a note in the chat, or if you're on camera, give me a quick thumbs up or a smile. So a couple of minutes to fill out that assessment. I'll set my timer now. About another minute or so. We've got a lot of people wrapping up here. And like I said in the chat, try not to think too hard. All right, if you are still working on that, feel free to keep working. For those of you who are done, how hard was it to evaluate yourself? Sean's shaking his head, not very difficult. He's in tune with who he is. Every time I read these statements or do an assessment like this, it depends on the day. So it depends on what I'm going through. I'll read a statement and I'll think, well, if it was this situation, it would be this. If it was this, it would be this. But keep that handy and next to you. We're going to be referring back to it throughout this presentation. So you'll want to keep that by you. All right, so today's content is going to be guided by these 5 leadership competencies outlined by Daniel Goleman. If you're not familiar with who Daniel Goleman is, he's an internationally known psychologist and the author of several leadership books focusing on leadership, emotional intelligence, and how the two relate to one another. Through his work, he's identified 5 components of emotional intelligence, and you're seeing them on the screen here now. If you take a look at your assessment, you'll see each statement has a color-coded box next to it. That color-coded box matches one of these competencies. So for example, if the box is red, it's going to relate to self-awareness, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we discuss putting these competencies into action. Now, how does this translate to your own personal leadership development? By improving these components of emotional intelligence, you'll be able to identify and react to the emotions of others and yourself more easily. So let's go ahead and take a look at each of these in depth so that you can recognize the qualities in yourself, in your team members, and then think about how they can make us more effective in the workplace and as leaders. The first up is self-awareness, and we've been working on this a lot since we started this process of leading from every level. Self-awareness is a crucial skill when it comes to leadership, and ultimately it's the ability to understand and interpret your own moods, emotions, and inner drivers and how these impact others. So it's not all about you, it's about everyone around you. Individuals who are self-aware are in tune with their actions. So being aware of your actions means realizing that you are responsible for the things that you do and their consequences. So their consequences could be negative, their consequences could be the impact that you have on others. So being aware of all of those things. These individuals are also aware of their goals, meaning their desires, their motivations, why you do the things that you do, living a purpose-driven life, as we often hear. They're also aware of their beliefs in order to consider their validity. So being in tune with your beliefs is something that we've also been working on. In one of the past journal prompts, we asked you to start to identify your core values. That's your true North Star. So if you haven't taken the time to reflect on that journal prompt, it's going to be very important for your own personal self-awareness. Also being in tune with your feelings instead of just unconsciously acting out, being able to stop and recognize in the moment what it is that you are feeling, how a situation is affecting you is what's going to be your key to self-management, which we're going to get to in just a little bit, and how you respond to those situations. We also want to make sure that we are aware of our inner conflict. So these are the things that are contradictory to our goals and our beliefs, the things that make us struggle a little bit, make us think a little bit more. And we also want to be aware of how you want others to perceive you. So living in a world where perception is reality, how one perceives you is their reality. So that's something that we need to constantly be thinking about. Hallmarks of people who have high self-awareness, these are typically people who are very self-confident. They have a realistic assessment of themselves, their thoughts, their behaviors, and they can, tend to make humor in a situation where they know, okay, that's not how I should have handled the situation, but let me recognize it and let's move forward on it. The biggest key, though, to self-awareness is reflection. So we're going to try it and practice. And again, feel free to come off of mute or type it in the chat. I'm going to give you guys a scenario. I want you to think of a situation recently or in the past where emotions were running really high. It could be at home, it could be in your personal life, in the workplace. But I want you to think of that situation and then think to yourself, what are some of the physical signs that tell you you are getting worked up emotionally? So for me, for example, when I find myself in this situation, I can feel from the inside out, my face getting flushed, my body getting warm. What are some of those physical signs to you, though, that you're experiencing a situation like this? Sammy says her heart starts racing. She gets a pit in her stomach. I can totally relate to that. Instantly speechless. Amanda says heart racing. My hands start to shake. I also get tunnel vision. Amanda, tell us a little bit more about that tunnel vision. What do you mean by that?
Tunnel vision is just like, it's almost like I don't have any more peripheral vision. It's just, I'm very focused, and generally it also comes with me like starting to like, put my head down. Like I can no longer like look at the person or other people. It's like that, it's just that like closing in around me kind of, is that kind of like the senses shut down.
Yeah. Thank you for that. We've got butterflies in my stomach, irritable, snappy with people. All signs that you're getting worked up emotionally. Overthinking. Miranda, that's good. I think we are all victims of overthinking sometimes, or, being in that moment and creating false scenarios in our head. Dr. Brene Brown, one of the prompts she always says is, the story I'm making up in my head is X, Y, and Z. And that's, a prompt that she uses to get it out into the open, to open up dialogue. Sean says the vein in his temple throbs, his speech speeds up, his thoughts race, and he feels a need to flee. Absolutely. So all of these examples we've heard: increase in heart rate, your body tenses up, you begin to breathe faster, and you're feeling discomfort, maybe a little fidgety, especially if you're in a meeting and you start to feel a little uncomfortable. The great thing about Zoom meetings is that you can turn off your camera, but if you're in a Zoom meeting where everyone has their camera on and you turn yours off, that's usually a pretty good indicator to others that although they can't see these things happening, they can feel them happening as well. Mark says my focus deflects from the topic to the uncomfortableness. Absolutely. So when we find ourselves in these situations and when we start to feel all of these things that we've just listed here, I want you to think about what you can do to relax. So again, feel free to come off of mute, type it into the chat. When you find yourself in that situation, what are the things that you can do to take a minute and relax? And I'm sure we'd all love to be sitting on the dock of the bay right now. Sammy says taking deep breaths helps me calm down. Easier said than done, though, when you're in the moment, right? Miranda says talking myself out of the negativity. Dawn says breathe. All great responses. So number one, listen to your body. What is your body telling you? Count to 10. We've all heard that forever, but if we actually pause, take a breath, take a minute before we respond, that's one of the things that I always try to remember. Our words are so impactful and words cannot be taken back. So take that time before you respond. Reflect on how it is that you are feeling. Sometimes we need to walk away for a minute. So getting up, taking a break. Got some other responses coming here. Sean says breathing, walking, closing eyes, visualizing a peaceful place. I love that. Focusing on the positive outcomes. Amanda says, if I'm able to get up, walk around, take a deep breath, and consciously relax my shoulders. We've got one comment in here. I usually don't. So I usually don't relax, I'm assuming is what that means. In my position, I have to push through. I want to come back to that in just a minute. Mark says, I tell myself everything will work out for me and pay attention to how it works out. Amanda says, I try to think, will this help me or will it hurt me? That's a great reflection, Amanda. Liam, I'm not sure exactly who this is, but if you're feeling comfortable to come off of mute and explain that a little bit more about having to push through, I'd love to hear more about that.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, the position I'm in, I'm basically I work in an office, but for the most part, I'm on my own.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't have, I guess, as much interaction as a lot of other people do.
Okay.
So when things start, I guess, stressing me out and, different things like that, because I've got guys in the field that rely on me to get everything done regardless, if I don't get my stuff done, they don't go to work tomorrow. So I have to get everything done. So when I am overwhelmed, it has to wait till the end of the day and then I can deal with it. I can't, in the moment, there's no way for me to deal with those items. I have to get through to keep everybody rolling.
At the end of the day, though, you're still taking that time to kind of pause and reflect. Yes. Is that what I'm hearing from you?
I don't know if it's so much reflect. It's just walking away from it for a little while and I guess just being done with it. But this morning, for example, I've got I found out one of our projects last night wasn't completely ready, so I was rescheduling projects at 5 o'clock last night.
Mm-hmm.
And then found out this morning that it was less ready than what the guy told me. We can't do anything on the project. Meanwhile, I've got a guy down there doing it, so I've already had to reschedule, get him moved, and I'm moving him to a project that I don't have prepped yet. So it's just kind of, I don't know, anxiety right now, I guess, just to try to push through and get everything done. And but for the most part tonight, when I'm out of here and everybody's set for tomorrow, then just get ready for the next day of it.
Yeah. And once everyone's set, that's when you can relax, right? A never-ending cycle. But it sounds like you do take the time at the end of the day, in the evening, maybe not to reflect, but to at least recharge, so that for your team, you're showing up as your whole self tomorrow and you can get through whatever challenges you're going to experience that day. And also what I'm hearing is that you're the right man for this job, because a lot of people would crumble under that kind of stress and anxiety. It can be very hard to be so flexible and agile in the moment. And it sounds like you do a great job at that. So I'm sure it's not, without stress or anxiety, but kudos to you for being able to shift so quickly for your team.
Thank you.
All right. So let's talk about self-awareness and action. We've already been talking about taking that time for reflection. It sounds cheesy, I know, but we need to do it, to take the minute to look back, however you feel most comfortable doing that. Journaling is something that I've been talking about a lot. You don't have to sit there, Dear Diary, for an hour. You can journal in bullet points. I know a lot of people who do that, just to get your thoughts out on paper, to look at it and reflect back on what went well, what you would like to do differently. Another great tool when it comes to self-reflection is recognizing your emotions in the moment. So we've heard a lot from people about how they, sometimes need to pause, step away. Doing that will help you recognize those in the moment so that you can find the best course of action, how you would like to respond. In the very first week, I sent you your owner's manual, or that guide to creating your individual development plan. Using your IDP can be a great way to strengthen your self-awareness. So it forces you to evaluate your strengths and weaknesses. A suggestion in there was to get feedback from others, so trusted advisors who will give you honest, direct feedback that you can use to craft what the items are that you need to work on. and it forces you to work on actively improving these areas. So again, that's a living, breathing document. It's never done. It's just something that you continue to add onto and to work on. So if you haven't been using that tool already, I would highly recommend that you go back to your very first leadership toolbox and take a look at your owner's manual. Also, you can use personality assessments to better understand yourself and others. These are kind of like the corporate horoscopes that exist in the world. You've got DISC, that's a great tool to help tailor your communication. We'll talk a little bit about that in our next session. Myers-Briggs is another popular one. Enneagram is one that has gotten very popular over the last few years, I would say. These are, meant for dialogue and not diagnosis. So they're not for you to take and say, okay, well, I am all of these things. Just a great reflection tool that are out there for you. You can find paid versions online. You can find free versions online, but anything to help your development keep going. I also want you to take a look at your self-assessment that we did at the start of this session. So questions 1, 8, and 11. Those are going to be the prompts that directly relate back to self-awareness. So depending on how you answered them, that's going to tell you if this is an area that you might need to lean into a little bit more, or if this is an area where you're on the right track and you are where you need to be for yourself and your team. So take a look at those questions. And again, they will be color categorized based on the chart that we saw earlier today. So that's how you'll know exactly which ones line up with the competencies that we're going through today. So for this one, 1, 8, and 11. Any questions or thoughts on self-awareness before we move on? Yeah, go ahead, Sean.
The journaling made me think of something that I do is, I'm sure others have this thing where, either ideas or remembering things you forgot to do or whatever come to you, when going to bed or in the shower or whatever. A lot of times what I will do is I use a task manager called Asana, or I'll email myself, or I'll text myself. Basically I will set myself up for the version of me that can solve that problem, to have that information then, and then release myself from having to think about it or worry about it or try to remember the phrasing or remember the points or whatever that are going on in my head, and stress out about having forgotten about it when I wake up in the morning.
I love that. Do you hear that, Amanda? Amanda loves Asana. That's a great tool. One of the tools that I use is just my general calendar. So if I need to come back to something, I'll schedule a reminder on my calendar, and that's my dedicated focus time to do that task. I'll attach the email if it's an email. But I like the way that you worded this, the version of you that, is equipped to handle this. So you're setting yourself up for success. You're releasing it for the evening so that you can stop and relax. And that's great. We don't want to get burnt out by working into all hours of the night. Amanda says Asana is the best. They use that, our marketing team does, but she also uses her calendar, Asana, and Post-its, all the tools, as long as you know where to look for what you're looking for. Any other comments on self-awareness before we move on? All right, so the next competency that we're going to talk about is self-management. So once we have that self-awareness, then kicks in our self-management. And this is the ability to control or redirect disruptive impulses and moods, and suspend judgment and think before acting. So like I said earlier, our words are permanent. Our words make an impact. So before we speak, stopping to think and using this self-management tool. One of the things that I love in seeing my own kids grow up is they learn a lot of this in school now. I feel like when we were in school, we didn't get into all of this touchy-feely type thing, but stop and think. My son, he's in kindergarten, and that's one of the things that they really, really reiterate, and something that he needs. But I think will be a life lesson for him, hopefully something that he sees himself relying back to often. So ultimately, self-management is how we deal with our stressors. An adult with poor self-regulation skills may lack self-confidence and self-esteem. They may have trouble handling stress and frustration, and then you can imagine how that would be expressed in terms of anger and anxiety. But those who are high in self-management typically are the trustworthy teammate or employee. They demonstrate strong integrity. They have comfort with others and openness and willingness to change. So self-regulation is really something that allows us to bounce back from failure and stay calm under pressure. And that's what we all need in our day-to-day life. So again, thinking back to reflection, which we're going to talk about a lot, I want you guys to think about a situation recently that caused you to be a little bit angry maybe or upset. You don't have to get into specifics again, but if you want to come off of mute or type it into the chat, when is the last time you were upset? And again, you don't need to share the specifics, but most importantly, how did you handle it? And how could you have handled it differently? So think about that. How did you handle it and how could you handle it differently? And this, I mean, this could be a marriage counseling session in itself. I don't know about you guys, but I can think back to some of those scenarios that could have been handled a little bit differently. And that can be for your own personal reflection if you don't want to share, or this is a great journaling prompt as well as you continue to dive deeper into your emotional intelligence, but using that reflection tool to recognize these scenarios, but then also set ourselves up for success the next time that we find ourselves in that situation of how we want to do it differently. Remembering it and executing it actually though is the biggest thing. So Kathy here in the chat, I'm gonna put this picture back up because that's perfect. Kathy says motorcycle ... So Kathy's husband, I'll share, recently bought a motorcycle after she asked him not to for like the last year. How would you have handled that situation differently though, Kathy? That's the big thing here. Amanda says yesterday she had an extremely frustrating meeting. I interrupted and cut the person off. I wish I had let them finish talking before stating my point. That's great self-awareness and reflection, Amanda. Now, next time, you know, pause, wait, let them finish, sit on it for a little bit. Okay, so let's talk about self-management in action. So recognizing that you have a choice in how you react to the situations is going to be the most important. Become aware of your emotional stressors. So know what those stressors are. That's going to help you recognize them when you find yourself in that situation. Try to remain calm in the face of adversity and keep your cool. Again, easier said than done, especially when you find yourself in a situation. I received a question a couple of weeks ago, and I knew we were going to be talking about self-management in this situation, so I wanted to save it for the group to hear what your thoughts are. So the question from one of our group members was, how can we use self-management, or how can we remain positive and be a positive influence in an adversarial environment? So we've all found ourselves in this type of situation before. How would you use self-management to remain a positive influence in an adversarial environment? What do you guys think? Yeah, go ahead, Sean.
One of the tools that I found, because unfortunately throughout my career, I found myself in a lot of adversarial environments. Going back to the very beginning is knowing your core principles and knowing who you are, and making sure that you don't let somebody else's behavior determine your behavior. So, you know, it's a practice, and you have to, you know, kind of work out every single situation and kind of reassess. But, you know, just because somebody's screaming at you doesn't mean that you have to give them permission to change how you would respond back. And I think
Mhm.
that's, a situation by situation, but, remembering that if you're working from integrity, if you're working from a sense of calm, a sense of problem solving, doesn't matter how the other people around you are reacting. If you tap back to that well, you'll find the path out of it eventually.
That's great, Sean. Thank you. So again, using those core values really as your true north when you find yourself in those situations. That's a perfect example. We're going to talk a little bit about empathy later on. So I think empathy is a great tool here. Using your core values, but also trying to understand where the other person is coming from before you respond and react can really help you, again, demonstrate your authentic leadership, be relatable in that situation. So we'll talk about that a little later on. Sammy says in the comments, sometimes I try to think to myself, if I act this way or say this thing today, how or will I be happy with how it turned out, how I handled the situation tomorrow? Sorry about that. So if I act this way, say this thing today, will I be happy with how I handled this situation tomorrow? That's great. Any other thoughts for our group member who has this question? And I think empathy will come into play a lot with this later on. So we'll come back to this when we get there. The next emotional intelligence competency that we're going to be talking about is motivation. So motivation is having a passion for work or to work for internal reasons that go beyond money and status. So money and status are those external rewards. We're talking about an inner vision of what is most important in life, joy in doing something, curiosity in learning, a flow that comes with being immersed in activity. So hallmarks of those who demonstrate high motivation, they have a strong drive to achieve, they are optimistic even when they are, find themselves in the face of failure, and they typically have organizational commitment or loyalty to where it is that they are, because they're there for a reason. Now, we talked a little bit about those external rewards, internal drivers. External rewards are not sustainable. They're not going to keep you happy forever. They're very short term. But when you look at yourself internally, these are intertwined with a higher purpose. So contributing to a cause, contributing to something that's bigger than ourselves, or doing things for the sake of really, I don't want to sound corny, but making the world a better place. So if you find the joy in what you do every single day, that's how you're going to work through your motivation. Motivation in action looks like finding ways to spend more time on what inspires you in your job. So we've all heard this saying before, love what you do and you'll never work a day in your life. So true though. When is the last time that you actually spent quality, reflective time thinking deeply about what you really want? So think about that. When's the last time that you actually spent the time to think about what you really want? And the answer to that prompt, is it what you're doing? That can be a hard truth if it's not what you're doing, but take some time to think about that. Use that as a journal prompt coming up, and then think about if it matches truly what you're doing. Passion is something that comes from our emotional brain, and when we lose touch with our deepest desires or our passions, we cut off our feelings and jeopardize our health. So it can really, really wear you down. If our activity isn't guided by these passions, we will not be able to muster up the motivation to pursue that activity every day. And that's why you see the people who wake up and genuinely do not look forward to going to work, or do not look forward to what it is that they're going to be doing in that day, because they're missing that passion piece, which is a key driver for motivation. Practicing optimism. We've talked about having optimism a little bit already. This is what's going to allow us to carry on despite any obstacle that we may encounter. It helps us understand our mistakes and that they're only permanent if we let them be. Okay, so if we're going to let them be permanent, they're going to continue to affect us, and that's completely our choice. So again, getting back to self-management, we have a choice in how we react to things. And then finally, setting inspiring goals for yourself. So linking your actions to the greater purpose or reframing the narrative that you have for yourself in your head. So for example, John F. Kennedy visited NASA in 1961, and while he was there, he met a janitor. He asked him what he did, and he said, "I'm helping put a man on the moon." So although he was only a janitor for NASA, not only a janitor, but he was a janitor, not an astronaut or anything like that. He saw the greater purpose in what it is that he did and how he contributed to that bigger picture. Thoughts on motivation before we move on? All right, we've got about 15 minutes here and 2 competencies to get through. The next that we're going to talk about is empathy, something that we can all use help in the world today. Empathy is the capacity to understand or feel what another person is experiencing from within their frame of reference. So the capacity to place oneself in another situation or put yourself in their shoes, as you often hear it, considering others' feelings when making decisions. So stopping and thinking about other people instead of our own personal desires when making our decisions. The ability to read between the lines, so see the things that aren't being said but are being felt or feeling with others. And using appropriate body language. So hallmarks of those who are strong in empathy, these are typically our experts in building and retaining talent, cross-cultural sensitivity, and service to their clients and customers. Now, not to be confused with apathy or sympathy, and we're going to look at this in a scenario. I want you to imagine that you come across a person who's stuck in the quicksand. So as we're seeing this hand here. Apathy in this situation would be standing back, not caring, not my problem. I'm just going to leave that person there. They can figure it out for themselves. Sympathy in this situation is a response that acknowledges that they're struggling, but it doesn't necessarily help the situation or even make it, or can even make it worse. A sympathetic response to the quicksand situation would be sharing their experiences and telling the person how to fix it. So, oh yeah, I found myself stuck in the quicksand once, and what I did was grab a rope that was tied to a horse, and the horse pulled me out. If there's no rope and there's no horse, it doesn't necessarily help the person who is in this situation. These people might say things like, at least your hands are above the sand, at least you can still breathe, or pull yourself out to try to lessen the situation. An empathetic response would be to relate to the person's situation and think deeply about what could be helpful to them if you were in their position. So again, putting yourself in their shoes. For the person that's stuck in the quicksand, you might want to think about carefully pulling them out while being aware of your own safety. You'd want to ask, what can I do that would be best for you? For example, like calling 911 or staying with the person until you knew that they were safe and out of the quicksand. So what in your realm of work, in your workplace, your organization, your industry, what situation do you think that you've encountered recently where empathy might be required or could have helped the situation, or maybe even where you saw someone with the sympathetic or apathetic type response? And kind of getting back to the prompt that we heard earlier, the question from one of our group members, this is why I think empathy would be a great competency to tap into when you find yourself in those adversarial environments. So you're there to help, but you might not understand where that person is coming from. So really, instead of the sympathy response, oh, you might try this, this, or this, and it might not necessarily help, put yourself in that person's shoes, try to understand what it is that they're feeling, what it is that they're seeing, how they're viewing the world, and then work together alongside of them from there. So instead of doing it to them, doing it with them. Yeah, go ahead, Sean.
Well, I think we've all experienced this, and we can tie it into directly the past year with COVID. within our families, within our, employment structures, with our clients and customers. It's so easy to be sympathetic and say, well, when I was building my business, or when I was
Mhm.
trying to solve these challenges before, and yada, yada, yada. That's different than, we are all in a very unique situation. So just laying out platitudes isn't helpful. Understanding that, the way that we reach out to people is different. The way that we sell to people is different. The way that we handle our family responsibilities is different. So we have to really actively listen to the new challenges, because we don't have a well of experience to pull from. We're all doing it differently than we've ever done it before.
Absolutely. It's a great example. Miranda says, having empathy and allowing grace for mothers who are overwhelmed with working remotely, homeschooling, and managing the household. I would say mothers, fathers, caregivers, everyone in that situation, absolutely. Dawn says, sometimes there is no way to help. And that can be true. I think even sometimes when we find ourselves in a situation where there might not be a way to help, we still want to try to fix it. So we want to try to provide those solutions, even though they might not be the most helpful. So sometimes just recognizing that and listening could be help in itself. So empathy in action looks like this: seeing things from the other point of view. And I added here, ask questions. So if you're having a difficult time seeing things from where someone else is coming from, turn to wonder, ask questions, educate yourself, and learn a little bit more. You're likely familiar with the saying, before you criticize someone, walk a mile in their shoes. Placing too much emphasis on your own assumptions and beliefs doesn't leave much space for empathy. Oh, we have another comment that came in here. Amanda says, I think acknowledging that sometimes help isn't what needed. Help isn't what needed. Just saying, I hear you and I understand goes far. Absolutely. You want to examine your own attitudes and motives. So if you want to understand the emotions of others, you have to learn to empathize from yourself first. By putting in the effort to analyze your own personal biases, you can gradually overcome them and be a lot more open and welcome to others. You also want to make sure that you're aware of how you feel in certain situations to help you better understand where someone's emotions might be coming from. And then finally, practice active listening and giving good feedback. We're going to talk a lot about active listening feedback next session when we focus on communication. But this could be, being aware of your nonverbal communication as well. So for example, your body language, not trying to interrupt or talk about your own feelings during the conversation. So Amanda gave an example a little while ago about wishing that she had not spoke up when she did and letting the other person finish speaking first. Try not to multitask during a conversation. That can be extremely difficult, even more difficult now that we're living in this virtual environment. We're constantly in these Zoom meetings just, to go over something with a coworker when we have a ton of stuff going on the other screen. But minimizing the multitask during conversations shows the other person that we're giving them our true full attention. Now, taking a look at your self-assessment, the questions that are going to reflect back to empathy are going to be 3, 13, and 15. So you'll see those labeled green on your grid. So depending on how you self-assess yourself there, you may or may not need a little work in this area. And finally, social awareness. So this is proficiency in managing relationships and building our networks. This might look like someone who has the ability to find common ground and build rapport, is an effective communicator. So again, communication being a big piece in emotional intelligence across the board. This might be someone who manages change and resolves conflicts tactfully and thrives in collaboration. So social skills and emotional intelligence might include persuasion and influencing others. We've talked about communication skills, having great conflict management, demonstrating leadership, being flexible with change, which we heard a little bit about earlier, building bonds. So I don't say that to say you're going to be or have to be best friends, but being able to open up a little bit and be personable. And then again, thriving in collaboration. So being very in tune with the team, how everyone contributes and everyone plays a role. So hallmarks of this individual, again, would be effectiveness in leading change, persuasiveness, and expertise building and leading teams. Social awareness in action. This looks like practicing effective communication. Again, we're going to go over that in depth in our next session. Practicing and analyzing body language and word choice of others. So being in tune with those around us, and again, our effect on each other. Helping others find solutions. So not necessarily always needing to be the hero to come in and save the day, but giving that opportunity to those around us by building them up. And then understanding the person that you are talking to and tailoring your interactions to what it is they need, how it is that they are responding, or their own personal styles. When we talked about self-awareness and taking those personal assessments, we talked about DISC. DISC is a great tool to understand others in tailoring your interactions to them. So DISC is a self-assessment. It's going to tell you a lot about yourself, but through your own people reading skills, you get a sense for what styles or primary behaviors those around you exhibit and how you can work with them a little bit better. So that's something to look into there. Start small if you need to. It can be as simple as just asking open-ended questions, encouraging others to talk about yourself instead of you talking about yourself all the time. Practicing good manners, paying attention to body language, which we've talked about. Being an active listener, and then shutting down those outside distractions so that you can truly get in tune with what it is that the other person needs from you. So looking back at your self-assessment, the questions that are going to align with social awareness are 5, 9, and 14. So social awareness, I think, is a very situational competency. We find ourselves in different situations. We react differently. We might not feel as comfortable with this person as we do with that person. So reflecting back on questions 5, 9, and 14 are the ones that are going to tell you if you need to lean into this competency a little bit more. All right, so we just went through all 5 of them very, very quickly. Definitely not as in depth as you can get, but hopefully it will give you a starting point of which competency you need to reflect on a little bit more. Again, we have here self-awareness, self-management, motivation, empathy, and social awareness. I mentioned that in your leadership toolbox, your suggested reading was going to be Emotional Intelligence 2.0. If you don't have this book, check it out at the library. If you buy it at a bookstore or off of Amazon, it comes with an assessment. Mine is ripped out for you to take online. That's going to be a much longer assessment than the one that we did today, but it's going to tell you right in front of your face, percentage based, which competency you need to focus on a little bit more. And that's one of the things I love about this book, is that it's not necessarily meant to be read front to back, but you can pick out the key sections that you want to focus on. And there are some very, very applicable, easy to use tools and resources in here for you to come back to time and time again. So this is one that I keep on my desk or close to my desk to refer to quite frequently. So in closing today, I just want to remind you that developing high emotional intelligence is incredibly important to the success of your career, to you developing as a leader, and to how you contribute and affect the team around you. So we talked a lot about becoming a person of influence in our first session, in that circle of influence that we have. Emotional intelligence is going to directly affect that circle of influence around you. When we have high levels of emotional intelligence, we're able to build strong working relationships and manage difficult situations more effectively, and that can help us all. But we'll also see more general happiness, have better mental and physical health, because we're not carrying the stress, the burdens with us throughout the day into the next day, kind of like Sean talked about earlier. We're going to see improved relationships with those closest to us. I mentioned that this could even be a couples counseling session. So with those in our household and those that we work with. And then ultimately, it's going to help us decrease in stress. So we're not dwelling on the situations or the stressors that kind of trigger us. We're recognizing them in the moment. We've got a plan of action to address it head on, and then we move on from it. So even if you've already heard about these elements of emotional intelligence, or you're in tune with some of them, it's important to look for opportunities to build it further. Use your IDP to do that. This will only increase your potential and improve the quality of your relationship. So again, I encourage you to go back to that owner's manual and start your individual development plan if you haven't already. I'll encourage you to look into this book, but use the self-assessment also that we completed today at the beginning of the session to look into these competencies a little bit more. So you're going to see additional information coming out in your leadership toolbox by way of journaling prompts, by way of articles. But those journaling prompts and building that self-awareness and reflection piece are really what's going to help you through all of these competencies. So questions as we wrap up today, comments on emotional intelligence or anything for the good of the group before we leave? Thanks, Mary and team. So glad you could join us. All right, with that, go ahead and stop recording.